What happens when faith, music, and queerness collide in a Catholic world that's not always ready for all three?
We're talking with Jessica Gerhardt, a singer-songwriter and theology teacher who's rewriting what it means to be Catholic, queer, and authentically yourself.
From navigating mixed faith family roots to challenging the ideal Catholic mold, Jessica's story is full of courage, vulnerability, and fierce creativity.
Welcome to Whiplash with Maxwell Kuzma,
The show where two queer Catholics, Max and Emma, dive into the dark and twisty Catholic faith we were handed.
and the beautiful mess we're building in its place.
It's a journey of exploration, excavation, and deconstruction.
As we challenge the limited view of God we were taught,
An embrace of fully affirming, expansive Catholic faith.
no topic is off limits and no question is too big or too small.
We're in this together, figuring out how to reconcile our queerness with our Catholicism, and maybe, just maybe, even reimagine them both.
So buckle up, folks. You might experience a little whiplash, but we're here for the ride.
Let's go! Welcome back to Whiplash with Maxwell Kuzma. I'm Emma, here with Max, and today we're excited to share a conversation with Jessica Gerhardt, a queer Catholic singer-songwriter whose music blends intimate folk and soaring indie rock, all deeply rooted in spiritual searching.
Jessica's journey is really powerful. Growing up in a mixed faith household, dealing with complicated family dynamics, and figuring out how to be both queer and Catholic in spaces that don't often feel welcoming or simple.
She's been exploring what it means to belong, especially within Catholicism's expectations, from youth ministry to the aesthetics of faith, while also carving out her own path through music and teaching theology with honesty and vulnerability.
Our conversation touches on the tensions between tradition and transformation, the challenges of fitting into prescribed roles, and how music can open us up to deeper emotional and spiritual truths when it's done with care.
It's a conversation about wrestling with identity, faith, and community, and finding a way to live authentically in the midst of all that complexity.
So settle in and join us as we dive into this beautiful, thoughtful, and deeply human conversation with Jessica Gerhardt.
Jessica, a little background for our viewers, and I know you'll delve into that. You grew up in a Jewish Catholic household. You celebrated Hanukkah, but no other Jewish holidays, yet Catholicism remained an integral, even if small, part of your identity within your family. But you also had this continued existence and continued presence of LGBTQ plus identity within your family. Your grandfather came out as gay when your father was 9 years old. Your godmother was a lesbian. So it was constantly this presence of queerness throughout your life, despite the continued presence, even if small, of Catholicism through your mother. With that being said, we're really interested to learn more about your story of how kind of this more, as you described in our previous conversation, this laissez-faire Catholicism evolved into you coming into contact with fundamentalism and how it affected your identity and coming out as a queer person.
Yeah. I grew up, like you said, Catholic Jewish household. We had Christmas and Hanukkah. Growing up, I was called a cashew. For me, my mom was raised Catholic by her single mom. It was like, what's the real core of it? What are the core messages? And so that was really important to her. She wanted to have me baptized. She wanted to have me dedicated to the Blessed Mother. Those were important rituals for my mom. And like receiving First Communion, receiving sacraments was important to her. Because my dad's side of the family, he was raised Jewish, but like Judaism wasn't very important to him religiously. So he wasn't like, no, we've got to have her bat mitzvah too. So he wasn't really into religion, and my dad's dad is gay. My godmother was a lesbian. So for me, I grew up in this like very God is love, and Jesus was a really kind person who loved people and included and welcomed people. And so I just kind of had these messages around me from an early age and as far back as I can remember of like everyone belongs. And yeah, there wasn't really like any specific messaging, at least that I associated with my religion until much later with like exclusion of LGBTQ people. That was not really something I was conscious of in an explicit way.
And do you think, Jessica, that there's an element of it being like a regional thing? Because like one other aspect is Emma and I both were raised in like the Midwest. And you know, I went to Franciscan University of Steubenville, which is in Ohio. And there's definitely different concentrations of different types of Catholicism in different areas. So I'm curious if you can speak a little to the West Coast of it all.
Yeah, oh, for sure. I mean, LA is somewhat diverse. There are conservative traditionalist Catholics in Los Angeles for sure, particularly in like more some of the San Fernando and Gabriel regions. Um, Definitely when you get into the Diocese of Orange, like Orange County has a little bit more of that conservatism. But I grew up in Santa Monica. The parish I grew up at is St. Monica's, which kind of has a reputation for being, their big slogan is all are welcome. It's one of the few LA Archdiocese parishes that has a gay and lesbian outreach ministry. My youth group experience was definitely one of like less emphasis on some of the like more controversial teachings, and again, more kind of the general understanding of friendship with Jesus.
Yeah, I'd also like to know a little bit more about like youth groups specifically,
Yeah.
because I think, like for me, that was definitely where I'm not going to say that people in my group were wearing chapel veils, but like it was definitely. It was definitely an environment where a lot of the conservative principles that were like being taught to us or modeled to us by adults were kind of playing out on a smaller stage.
Totally. So yeah, my youth group, I don't really remember a lot of Eucharistic adoration when I was a kid. I do remember going to Life Teens Six Flags trip. All I remember is that we like had a Catholic field trip at Six Flags, and I remember funnel cake and rides and like maybe like and then like mass at the park. But I didn't really remember any Eucharistic adoration from my teenage years. I mean, and like there was one young adult who started helping out with youth ministry who she was this like surfer who was really into ska and punk and wore a True Love Waits ring. And that was like, she was just, we all were like, she's that zany, crazy Catholic who's like way obsessed. She had a miraculous medal that's like this big. And I mean,
Whoa.
I loved her dearly. She's very goofy. And I think that there was a sort of sense that like her extreme devotion was like, that's her own flair. It never felt like this expectation that like we all needed to be like her. It was sort of like, she's like especially into her Catholic thing. Like that's her hyperfixation, like good for her. So I remember a bit of that. Our youth minister introduced us to the show God or the Girl, which was like this reality show about men who were either in seminary or discerning seminary who had girlfriends. And I think I was dating a guy at the time who later told me he was interested in becoming a priest. And I was like, I'm not about to be one of the God of the girls. I'm not going to do it. I'm not going to do it. So when he told me that my senior year, I was like, we're breaking up. I'm not going to let you deliberate with my heart. But yeah, so that was my youth group. Yeah, there wasn't a heavy emphasis on Eucharistic adoration or charismatic stuff. There was a little bit of imaginative prayer that I remember, like, close your eyes, imagine Jesus is sitting next to you. What does he look like? What is his facial expression like? What does he sound like? How does he speak to you? But yeah, it never felt like overly reliant on too much supernatural supernatural things or anything like that. It felt very just like kind of practical. St. Monica's has a lot of service opportunities and service organizations, and so I have a lot of memory of doing like kind of charity and or solidarity sort of related things. In hindsight, some of them were like very like early oddies, we mean well, kind of thing that I think we're like, oh, maybe that's not the most useful way to be of service. But I mean, at least I still associated a lot of my involvement with church with like praxis that more versus like devotion.
Yeah, that's actually a really interesting distinction too that I like. The idea of um, how does our faith look in action, like applied when we go out, like maybe a little bit more of a emphasis on social teaching, Catholic social teaching in
Oh
a way,
yeah.
yeah, rather than like we need to be totally locked down and just in the adoration chapel, and if the kids are in there, we know
Yeah.
they're okay.
Yeah. Yeah. Oh, and then you had asked about like relationship to faith and my family. So the summer after my confirmation, when I chose to become a peer leader, I went to this training camp for a week called Christian Leadership Institute that at the end they had each of us like make a goal for our faith. And I remember them really driving home the importance of weekly mass, like going to mass every Sunday. And I don't really remember feeling like, oh, I'm afraid if I don't do it, it's mortal sin and I'm going to go to hell. But more like, if I'm really committed to this walk as a newly confirmed Catholic, like going to mass every Sunday is like a way that I can grow in my relationship with God. A piece that's like kind of part of a separate story would just be like my parents split up at the beginning of my sophomore year. So my dad left and my youth group kind of just became this refuge for me, this like place to have community and a little bit of like reprieve from some of the like pain at home and drama at home. So I think that also solidified for me this sense that like at church, I find community, I find belonging, I find consolation and God in and through others. So, that was a big piece of it for me. But yeah, I didn't get exposed. I actually really love Eucharistic adoration, but I wasn't exposed to it until my earliest memories of it are like young adulthood. Maybe they had
Yeah.
it at like my Jesuit parish that I went to in college, but I feel like it was like honestly post college that I started to learn more about regularly occurring Eucharistic adoration nights or XLTs and that sort of thing. I think maybe it was like on the rise trend wise in the like post 2010 2011 years.
Yeah, it's definitely that something that I always really appreciated, just kind of as a meditative contemplative practice. I find that those are the ones that I'm kind of most drawn to. Even though I went to Franciscan University, which, there's the Steubenville conferences that have these really big praise and worship, like those events where you have like a monstrance being paraded around with a spotlight on it and people are like fainting or whatever.
Right.
That is not something, like, I actually never went to those, even though I went to that school. That was like not really my style, but I will say that I always really appreciated the contemplativeness of it. But I wanted to go back to two things really
Yeah.
quickly. Um, when you mentioned the miraculous medal, I just wanted to make a note for people who are only listening that it was about the size of your palm, which is a pretty big size for a miraculous medal, because normally they're maybe the size of a quarter or so.
Yes.
And then the second thing I wanted to kind of run back to really quick was God or the Girl show.
Yes. 100%. And I feel like we've hit on the crux of what this episode is. And I think it's meaningful for me to be here because so much of what brought you both together in your experiences was this idea of youth ministry in the church and
Mhm.
education in the church, both post-secondary and youth ministry education for Catholic young people. And it's something really interesting that Max and I have talked about, how my mom was my Catholic education teacher from basically kindergarten through 8th grade in confirmation. She would follow
Mm.
me.
Which is
Yeah,
wild.
every single year. She did not do this for my sister, so I don't know what I triggered. um, but I think what you speak to is really interesting because when you were discussing this surfer figure that listened to ska and had a True Love Waits ring, again, purity culture, True Love Waits organization, it reminded
Mm.
me of, I think, what we're seeing a lot of now, of kind of this like countercultural Catholicism, of this
Mhm.
fundamentalism and traditionalism being a key
Yeah.
piece of what young people are saying is like a revolution against current values. Um,
Yep.
which I
Yep.
think is really interesting.
Yeah, I mean, my ex, who is a priest now, he was also a surfer. He loved death metal and like punk, and like he would go to concerts where he would wreck or be in like mosh pits. Like he was very like in that world. And he had like wacky hair and like rockabilly was, he psychobilly, like he was definitely a quirky character. And honestly, like, I mean, I don't want to make the episode about psychoanalyzing my ex. He, as a priest, he's gotten very like ad orientem. He's very conservative, very traditionalist. He's kind of friends with a lot of people in that like life teen crowd, and like baptized babies. And he's just very in that world. But yeah. And then when he was discerning priesthood, inspired by our life teen youth minister, I think there's a component to edgy kind of alternative people becoming very, very devotional as almost this sort of like, I have to pendulum swing. It's very Augustinian, because like Augustine was like, oh my God, I sinned so bad. I have to like, pendulum to the opposite extreme. And I feel like that happens with a lot of converts and or reverts who kind of have this like difficult time maybe forgiving themselves for things or holding themselves, like letting them, like just being gentler with themselves, often seems like a reaction to both like their internalized shame, like a shame wound, and then also like a fear of where do I belong. Particularly, I see this among like white dudes.
As we've talked about with the masculinity series.
Yeah. And we had this conversation. I think it was after The Last Jedi came out, because I used to love Bishop Barron. And then he wrote this article critiquing The Last Jedi for this extreme feminist agenda, and had this like whole crusade against like women in men's roles, making the men look like idiots. And I was like, okay, as if like Leia, who's a general, like doesn't also kind of like make a lot of the guys look like buffoons in the first trilogy, but okay. But whatever, that, all that aside, we had this conversation where my friend had said, like, I think that the problem is like, if you start giving women all these roles that are men's roles, like priesthood, then what will be left for men? And I just was like, bro, you just got ordained a priest in the Church of Jesus Christ because you ideally believe in a God of abundance, a God who doesn't make spare humans, that we all exist with a vocation, like God intentionally places each of us here. How can you be worried that if a woman is doing something that you or any particular individual man don't also have a specific calling, that there's like a scarcity of vocations in God's kingdom? Like it kind of shocks me that like people who literally commit their lives to like priesthood, like could have such a scarcity mindset. And I think that is also really prevalent in the kind of conservative traditionalist camp, which is why there's such a like, policing of categories and boxes and who fits in them and what qualifies you to fit in them. That I don't see any other explanation for it.
No, I think what you say is really important, and it reminds me of as well. And what for me is really important about this is that I was someone who was raised in the church since I was a little kid in a deeply devout Catholic family, but I was never really involved in youth ministry. I don't think we've touched on it a lot in the podcast, but a lot of what I experienced was more of the one isolated incident of being involved in this kind of true beauty retreat. And that being the first time that I really offered myself up to participate in youth ministry, because I constantly had felt like I was boxed out with this whole seeing, especially that there was this deficit in terms of devoutness and holiness and sanctity, so that there seemed to be a competition for who could perform and who could experience and possess a level of devotion, a level of humility, which is counterintuitive and hypocritical, that who can be the most humble person.
Yes, totally.
Yeah, but it reminds me of the same of so much of what you're talking about with traditionalist values tied to the True Beauty retreat that I attended a while
Mm,
back, which was my one kind of a piece into youth ministry. I was like, you know what, I haven't done it yet. I was like, I keep feeling like this is a little bit holier than thou, but I was like, I don't know. I can't judge these group of people because I haven't taken the first step to understand and be part of it. And so I participated, and it was exactly like you say. It was very much this early aughts kind of countercultural movement of like, what if we really focused on like and recentered these young women in traditionalist gender roles in
mm.
ways that not only affirmed what they assumed a woman was or could be, but also from the very beginning, it's similar to Max and my experiences in fundamentalist Catholicism growing up, that if we catch them young, we can like create this nexus and create this audience and population of people that are hungry for tradition.
That's so interesting. That's so different from how I grew up.
I'm glad you highlighted the part about being young. And I also wanted to add just one other thing onto that, which is um, I feel the impact as well about the performance, like this idea that so I think with the devotionals and with the chapel veils and with like the holier than like I can see how, you know, the more conservative path provides like these very concrete like visuals of like, okay, you can visually see if I'm doing it right or if I'm doing it the best. I also feel though like I was very wrapped up in that well I can do this. I can do the prayers. I can go to daily mass. I can do the things I'm supposed to do. But there was something that I wasn't able to do that was never communicated to me necessarily directly, but was always hanging over me, which is that I was not cisgender or heterosexual, and it was always like hanging over me that I wasn't going to be able to actually be like the best version of whatever this idea of a perfect Catholic is,
Mm,
because I was never fully playing into those elements of it. And I think for a lot of young queer people orbiting around these more conservative spaces, that's an awareness, or that's something that really impacts us as well.
totally. Yeah. I mean, I wasn't aware of my own queerness when I was a teen. I mean, I think there were some purity culture messages here and there, but they weren't driven home in a very particular way. And they certainly weren't reinforced in my household because my parents they found out they were pregnant with me 6 months into dating each other. They got married when I was like a year and a half old. So even if some of that messaging was coming home, it was never like coming home from anything I might have heard at youth group or church. It was like not heavily emphasized, and B, like not something that was reinforced at home, and and it also wasn't something that like my peers that were also peer leaders, like anyone like other than like the one like young adult who was like giant miraculous medal, like nobody around me was like really taking those teachings very seriously as far as I could tell. So like it seemed to me that it was kind of this like, we just have to say it, but like we know that no one's really going to follow it kind of teaching. So it was wild to me to encounter people, well, evangelicals in college, because I was the token Catholic in the intervarsity campus group at my college, where I learned that like the woman of the married couple who led our Bible study and worship group, she was like very firm about virginity until marriage, and I was like, you're like one of the first like sort of normal people. And normal is relative. She was definitely this like art hippie singer songwriter who would like lead worship with a banjo and like would sing songs about worshiping and praising God with the trees. So she's very hippie Christian. And I thought like I related to that energy. She's kind of the first like charismatic and or mystical kind of person I met in real life. And she also, though, was somebody who'd like really was strong about the idea of abstaining until marriage. So that was like the first time I was like, oh, you took this really seriously. And yet she was still like not somebody I felt like I was excluded by if I wasn't living that way when I was younger. That was an interesting messaging to see, like, especially in my 20s when I started getting to know young adult groups and finding that there were some where it just seemed like everyone wanted to date to marry and like people were hooking up, and most of the young adult events were like meet up at a bar if you're Catholic and over 18 or more like over 21. Yeah. Um, and I was like 21, 22, right out of college, and I was not thinking about marriage yet. I was like, I just want to find a job and like get my feet wet as like an adult in the world, not in college anymore. And then there were these other young adult groups that were very like, we take this teaching extremely seriously. So it was like, oh, okay. So I feel like for me, something I noticed you guys were talking about, like performativity of traditionalism. I think that's a piece of it. The idea of like how other Catholics are seeing you and like approving of your Catholicity. I think another piece of it is the internal sense of maybe fear of God's judgment, fear of hell if you do the wrong thing, which I think is still more focused on an external relationship to God through what other people tell you versus like an internal relationship with God. I think if a person really has a deep communication with God, like, I don't know, I think a lot of that like fear doesn't come from an authentic relationship with God because God is love. So the messaging, if you're really listening to God's still small voice, isn't one of like shoulding and insistence and urgency. It's one of just loving you as you are, reminding you of your goodness and your belovedness, and like reminding you to come back to who you are. And so, yeah, I think that like some of the fear that kind of drives behaving the right way is like still sort of this external thing. And then there's also this very codependent component of if I'm really Jesus' disciple, I have to do all these things to try to help other people see that I'm a disciple in the hopes that they'll become disciples, which, you know, is the way that evangelization kind of gets taught to us in youth ministry, in young adult ministry, and in how to be a youth minister. There's this sense that what your job is to like convince other people to like be more devout and to like live out their faith a certain way. And I think that I thank God my spiritual director in my 20s was like, your job description isn't to make kids believe or behave in any particular way. It's to simply like create opportunities for them to encounter God. And that's about it. And because you're not the Holy Spirit. It's not your job to be the Holy Spirit. And I was like, oh, that's such a weight off my shoulders, because it certainly seemed that way until you said it that way. So
you followed exactly what we were excited to talk about today. Not only youth ministry, but the concept of this performity of traditionalist Catholicism and fundamentalism. I think you bringing up the idea of codependency and again, this idea of performance, for me, resonates with this idea that you have to perform and be a good enough Catholic, this ideal Catholic that I think we're all talking about in this episode, in order to evangelize and connect with other people. And I think that fear, those feelings of shame and fear around who we are, comes from the idea that we can never be a good enough person, a devout enough person, both to ourselves and how we self-police, which you talk about. And it's exactly what you talk about in terms of traditional gender roles. Nobody could ever be a good enough man or a good enough woman within these systems to accomplish what they're asking us to do. And it's especially harmful for young people.
I also think the part that you mentioned about what will be left for men if women are able to maybe be ordained or have other roles in the church, that is very interesting because there's definitely been reporting on this about the increase in like young male men to conversions into more fundamentalist religion in recent years. And there's also been really interesting academic studies of like this as a trend, like basically men's role in American society over the last 40 years now, like just looking at what was presented to men as aspirational, like what was the vision that they were sold, and then what was the reality that they experienced, and kind of the contrast of those two things. And I feel like that this sentiment of like the scarcity mindset for men specifically, I think is a huge driver in a lot of the behavior that ends up being self-defeating for men as well. Like that's the thing, is like it's presented to men as if, maybe in the context of religion, that, you know, this is a special role for you, like this is a special thing for you, and then, but ultimately what happens is it becomes more narrowing or more controlling for men too. So it's like
Yeah.
there's a little bit of a contradiction there.
Oh, yeah. Yeah. I mean, I think it really relates to privilege, and like in a really simple sense, if you have a disproportionately large piece of pie and then people come around and be like, hey, you got to give up some of your pie so everyone can have some. You're like, but this is my pie. Cain and Abel, right? Like they're brothers, and one kills the other kind of because he's like, well, you didn't like appreciate what I did as much. Like, and that's kind of at the heart of it, like this feeling of like, am I not enough? And that's like that wasn't at all the issue. But this sort of scarcity of recognition, scarcity of appreciation, and all these things. And I feel like that's been a part of the human story for probably as long as we've been Homo sapiens. In a church that talks about like reparation for sin, we have a difficult time thinking about privilege and oppression and reparations in other social situations. Like, and I think that's why you see that kind of conservatism and traditionalism all wound together, because it's, well, we want to maintain the way things are because they were more comfortable for those of us who were in power. And if we distribute that more broadly, if we enter it more deeply into solidarity, well, I'm going to lose something. And that's what's so wild about all this Exodus 90, penance, fasting, holy masculinity stuff. I'm like, okay, so you can take cold showers, you can fast from all these things, you can have all these intense devotions, but you can't like bear the discomfort of checking your privilege. That's the penance that's just too much for you. Like that cross is too heavy to carry. There's, these performances of sacrifice that are actually maybe vanities or actually easier to access than other things. Things that really do challenge your comforts in more social ways than anything. And I don't know, I think that that's just an interesting double standard that I see a lot.
100%. I also want to tie in and just put the little breadcrumb of something that we previously talked about prior to this conversation with you that I loved, ties into this idea of principles before personalities.
Yes. Yeah, that part of 12-step spirituality, which has been deeply impactful in my life, is one of the traditions of the 12 steps. And it's, I think, something that the Catholic Church could really take note of. We have this tendency to put people on pedestals, Catholic influencers, Catholic, professional Catholics. When we put specific individuals up on these pedestals, they're bound to fail us because they may not always live up to the principles that are shared in the community or in the traditions very perfectly, because nobody's perfect. Another part of 12-step spirituality is progress, not perfection. We've got a lot of P and P kind of slogans, but progress, not perfection. Goodness gracious, Catholics could take note of that too. But yeah, like really, when it comes to what does it mean to be a Catholic, it's like, what are our principles? And this whole notion of like near occasion of sin and scandal, I think puts way too much pressure on personalities. It puts way too much pressure on people. And it's very codependent, because ultimately, if I do something that is sinful or not what the church teaches. I mean, I think it depends on context. If I'm raising children and I have an impact on young people as an adult to minors, that's one thing because you have influence over them. And Jesus speaks very strongly about adults who influence minors. But in terms of adult to adult or peer to peer, yes, peer pressure is a thing, but also every person is responsible for themselves and responsible for their own conscience and how they follow it. And I think primacy of conscience is something that, practically speaking, is not emphasized nearly enough. And just in terms of like church structure, we don't do enough to teach lay people how to pray, how to listen to God, how to discern the voice of God. We focus a lot more of the interpretation and power and approval and authority on priests, on the clergy. And I mean, it really upholds clericalism. And so instead of actually me discerning anything for myself, I go to these personalities for guidance and approval instead of giving each individual the tools to learn how to discern the will of God, God's will for their particular life. I think that that's something I feel grateful to have been introduced to through the Jesuits and an Ignatian spirituality. Realizing like our particularity in the broader context of solidarity can be really powerful instead of, and I think we have this inverse where we're like just sheeple. Sometimes we just kind of are like, well, what do we all just go along with it? And we miss the beauty of participating in those communal practices, those communal prayers, when we don't actually ever get introduced to how we can cultivate our own direct line to God and then participate collectively within those other broader contexts.
I think there's also definitely something to be said for people's individual ability to have self-awareness, first of all, but also to be able to regulate. I was thinking particularly when it comes to men, you know, as a transgender man, it's kind of one of my big life's works, which part of this is you know, hyperfixation, but part of it is also like, because of being trans, is masculinity.
Yeah.
And is the question of if not what makes a good man, but also what makes a man. Like what does society say a man is, and also, you know, what are the differences in my experience because of the socialization that I went through for many years living as a woman, to what the experience of someone who is treated as a male from a young age. And something that really stands out to me with that is, in the topic of regulation, I think one of the big divisions is that I think young boys and men are pretty much only offered a physical pathway to regulation, which is where you see like fighting, wrestling, sports, anything that's like physical and external, whereas women are kind of presented kind of almost exclusively like a nonviolent emotional pathway. But like if you think about that as that escalates into adulthood, if the only way you know how to process anything that you feel is through physical action, you can see how that can become a problem very quickly, because so often that physical action is going to be you acting on another person, which is going to be inappropriate a lot of the time if there's, you know, stuff that you need to work out yourself. And I mean, obviously there are healthy outlets for physicality, you know, like exercising or doing something by yourself to release some physical energy. But I'm not sure that all men are understanding those distinctions, and also lacking the emotional side, lacking those skills stunts your ability to grow in certain ways if you don't even know how to like go there.
Right.
Not to go too much off into the masculinity of it all.
No, but like to bring that back, like that ties in with just this idea of like, you know, the church teaches self-mastery and there's wisdom in that, but you have to have an integrated approach to that, or you just have white knuckling. And I think that's a lot of what we see in purity culture in priests,
This, Jessica, this.
principals. We need that. We do need self mastery, but we also need the emotion. You need the both. You need the emotional regulation, and you need, yeah, like you need to be integrated in your mind, heart, body. So, that's like love the Lord your God with all your mind and your soul and your strength and your heart, right? Like you need to have all those things integrated. And also touching on what you were saying about being trans, about where I thought you were going to go, and then you went a different direction. I was like, oh, okay. But the idea of experience and relying on and trusting your own experience. And I think this is really key for queer Christian people. I think there's an
100%.
issue within the church of like encouraging people to distrust their own experience and their
Yeah.
own interior wisdom. And I think that sets up a really yikes internal psychosis or just psyche, where you feel like you can't trust anything,
Yeah.
any consolation, any sense of God or the Spirit. How can you ever know what to do or where to move? And that's a great way for somebody to be easily manipulated and taken advantage of by somebody who says they can speak for you and that they can speak into your life. They have prophetic words to give you. That's a great opportunity for somebody to manipulate another person. And I mean, you see that in so clearly in Alana Chen's story, and from when you guys did the interview with Simon about the Dear Alana podcast. And like, sadly, I feel like her story is so representative of many people's experience in the church. And when people with these pedestals, these personalities who are put on pedestals, have power and authority and respect and credibility given to them to essentially like take the place of another person's own experience of themselves and their identity and their sense of where God is calling them. And again, this is why it's so unfortunate that the church doesn't promulgate those spiritual tools that are part of our tradition. Ignatian spirituality. I mean, he went through the Inquisition. They're like, "Are you just a witch?" And he's like, "No, I swear." And they like tested it. So it's like, this is a part of our Catholic tradition. And I think these tools are really just kind of, oh, well, those are really useful for individuals to know themselves, but that would be so New Age. Let's put those to the side. And it's like, no, that's not New Age. That's Christianity. I think that we don't have to throw out the baby with the bathwater. We can still hold on to our encounters and our experiences of God and hold lightly our intellectual interpretations of those, how we think of them. We can hold lightly these convictions about things, though I think we have to lean into the unknowing, that I'm not God. I do the best I can. I know I've experienced something, but I don't know what I know about that actually, or what that means, or anything. We can make meaning out of it. We don't have to make meaning out of it. But again, like the importance of letting ourselves trust our experience, even if our interpretation of our experience can be fluid, I think is really something the church also needs more of.
Definitely. And something I think of within the conversation about mystical experiences or charismatic experiences is when there is a spiritual experience that has an element of being constructed.
Yeah.
I think that's where there are some issues, which ties into this thing I'm talking about at the Steubenville conferences, where you have, the incense is billowing and then the spotlight is highlighting the golden monstrance, which is super reflective in the darkness with all the smoke from the incense billowing around it. And you're kind of primed because people are like, you can fall on us, we'll catch you. And importantly, the role of the music in all of that. And so in constructing an experience, I think often of the mystics and mystical experiences in general as essentially something that's kind of like bestowed on you in a way. I was going to say something that you don't seek, but I don't think that's true, because I do think the mystics were seeking have been seeking very earnestly, but it's not like you're seeking a mystical experience for the purpose of a mystical experience. It's that you're seeking God and then you have a mystical experience of God.
Yeah.
And I just wanted to set up that dichotomy there because, again, when we have, such a divide in society where the roles are so clearly defined and you're only supposed to play the role that you're playing as a man or a woman in society, and then also even more heightened in church, and then you have all these things that can add to a construction of an experience, like the impact of highly emotive music. Suddenly all of these formative spiritual experiences are kind of being like packaged and constructed. It's not leaving much room for the individuality of you to express who you actually are. And on that note, not to like monologue too much, but I also feel that that's why queer theology, queer liberation theology, and even we recently talked about queer Catholic joy on the podcast, why those things are so like subversive to this establishment is because it's really this idea that we do have this ability to know these things about ourselves that diverge from these roles that have been presented as the only way, and that in that self-knowledge is God.
Yeah. Yeah. Yeah, totally. Um, I want to wait, Emma, did you have anything to add
No,
to
no,
that?
no. What the one thing I was going to say is that I think what so much that you're talking about resonates with me just in providing that context of like I was definitely in that position even though I wasn't in youth group and religious education, which I know we've talked about before. Like
Mm-hmm.
we got to an extent where like I was convinced I as a queer person didn't know my own body and couldn't trust
Yeah.
my own ideas of
Yeah.
sexuality and gender. And
Yeah.
I think that was such an inherent part about, and I think it also ties to the idea that within these youth groups, there was no discussion of LGBTQ plus people for the fear that if we talked about it, it would create queer people, when in actuality, the
Mm-hmm.
erasure was even more harmful.
I was going to say, I do think one reason it's not talked about is also the fear of alienation. I think a lot of youth ministers just don't want to touch it with a, 10-foot pole or whatever, because they just are sort of like, ooh, but like, how do we say, God loves you, but also don't do that,
Yeah.
like the way I was like, I'm going to talk about it because we got queer kids here,
Mhm.
whether they're open about it or not. I was
100%.
like, well, let's be real. Like, okay, so we have the catechism, and it's worded in the way that it's worded, for better or for worse, right? That's something we can critique. We can say, hey, that feels sad and hurtful. What do we know about what our faith teaches? God loves you. And I would just go back to kind of an Ignatian-esque approach. I was like, regardless of your sexual orientation or whoever you're attracted to, I invite you to talk to God about it in your heart. Notice what comes up in terms of how love, how joy and consolation invites you to express love to other people. And if you're completely oblivious to or like pushing out your own experience, you can't hear and discern with the Holy Spirit. You're literally like, no, I don't want to hear what you have to say, Holy Spirit. I'm like gonna just ignore you. And I unfortunately think that gets reinforced in the church. All of that within the sort of construct of youth ministry conferences and their intention to cultivate emotional experiences, and the choreography and the stage and setup, like you were saying, the lighting, the particular music cues, all of it primes people and makes them vulnerable emotionally. And then what you do with them when they're in that state can be good or can be really harmful. What are the lyrics really saying? What's the theology of those lyrics? Are you heavily emphasizing how much of a wretch somebody is and making them feel really bad about themselves? Or are you just saying like, Holy Spirit, you're welcome here. Come flood this place and fill the atmosphere. That is a beautiful chorus. And like this idea of just like, fill me. And like, I think people are open to, they're making themselves open. But then do you have speakers who give really bad theology at that point when people are opening themselves? Because I think human beings in general have a desire to be open. They have a longing to have mystical experiences. I first was introduced to some of that when I started working in youth ministry, and I was part of a life teen retreat where all these kids were like told, and by the way, when we come around with a monstrance and we hold it before you, we have people around the room who can catch you if you fall. So again, priming. I was a psych major, so we learned a lot about the power of priming people. But if you set them up with an expectation that they're going to fall back, it almost is like a sort of should. And like, no one wants to be the kid who's not open enough to the Holy Spirit, right? Like, because kids are especially concerned with what their peers think of them, how they look around each other, who's ultimately profiting off of it. Because there's like a whole industry of people making money off of these charismatic youth conferences or even adult conferences. And I think that that's where it gets, I think that's where you need to have some healthy skepticism and some questioning and look at who's doing what. And also, if somebody needs to be like, here are my spiritual supernatural gifts to prove that God is real, I'm usually just like, no, why do we need that? Even like, you know, so many people with this Eucharistic revival this past year, Carlo Acutis about to be canonized. Well, we'll see. I'm assuming Pope Leo is still going to canonize him. I think there's so much heavy emphasis being placed on Eucharistic miracles. But why is like finding like under a microscope that a Eucharistic host has like AB blood cells in it? How is that more of a Eucharistic miracle than like somebody going to mass and feeling a sense of equal worthiness, somebody who's unhoused or poor, feeling just as much worth before God as like all these wealthy people at the same church? Like, that's a Eucharistic miracle, seeing yourself as one in the whole with everybody. A lot of the mystics and the saints and the doctors of the church, the desert parents, were people who had very dry, non-supernatural, like pretty plain, boring, simple lives. And like monasticism was like about finding God in the stillness, finding God in the simplicity. And I think that maybe it's out of desperation to like regain membership in the church after so many people have left. We have to like wow them with like, you know, shock and awe. But I really think we just got to get back to our roots. I think that would actually attract people. That's another 12-step spirituality thing they could take a page from, is attraction, not promotion. Parents of teens that I used to minister to would be so anxious for their kids who were falling away from the faith. And I'm like, look at you right now. You are covered in anxiety. Why would anyone want to be Catholic if being Catholic makes you look like this? You are not a poster child of peace and serenity that should come from a relationship with Christ. Focus on your relationship with Christ. Focus on the love and the peace of Christ. Let that control your heart. I still feel pain. I still feel stress, but somehow this is my anchor. And I think that's more attractive to people than all the shoulds, all the finger wagging. But again, I think we get it all backwards. We get it all twisted.
Yeah. And I think like with the overemphasis that you're talking about on I'm just going to call it the supernatural light show. I was just imagining like one of these hermits up on his pillar and he's got a disco ball and a fog machine and laser lights. I was like, that's not, what I wanted to say is that I actually think that even like this idea of dryness can actually also be mystical.
Oh, 100%. Yeah.
I'm thinking of like Jesus praying alone in the desert and then he goes toe to toe with the devil, or even in the Garden of Gethsemane. I think the key is the emphasis on your spiritual journey. So in this emphasis on supernatural, it's kind of like, it's prescriptive again. It's this idea that there has to be these supernatural events for this to count. Like there's a prototypical spiritual journey, and if it doesn't have an act of God where you're smited down like Saul to Paul, then it doesn't count. But that's not really how it is, because the thing about the spiritual journey is that, first of all, it should be grounded in that type of discernment, some of that Ignatian spirituality stuff, because so that it is your journey, not just like some imitation of something that you think it should be, but it is actually coming from you and it's yours. And so within that train of thought, I also wanted to ask you a
Mhm.
little bit more about like your specific journey within like your own identity of LGBTQ
Yeah.
stuff, and like how that like came up for you and how you related to it within this background that we've kind of set up of the type of Catholicism that you were experiencing, and then kind of like different things that you experienced that led you to where you are now.
Yeah, sure. I mean, looking back over my childhood, there are a lot of little like queer coded things, moments, similar with like getting a adult diagnosis for ADHD, and I'm like, oh, there it was all along. But for me, it wasn't a conscious thing until I was a freshman in college. A female friend who was identified as bi and presented as a woman at the time, though they now identify as non-binary. We were dancing. We were good friends. We were dancing at some dance party, and they were like, if we keep dancing like this, I'm going to want to make out with you. And I was like, huh? Like, what? And I was a little stunned and shocked and a little uncomfortable at first. And then I kind of was like, actually, I'm kind of open to, like, interested in that idea with this person. And it was the first time I had felt that kind of reciprocal interest with somebody of the same sex as myself. I went home and told my mom that I was bi. And she's like, oh, sweetie, I had a bi phase too. I was desperately in love with my girlfriend for a few months. But she was so masculine. She was really more like a man. And so she just trivialized it all. That it would still just come up randomly. Sometimes I would find certain guys attractive, and then I would meet women I found attractive, and I was like, she cute. And then working in youth ministry, working in the Catholic Church, being surrounded by some of the conservative trads who were like, well, you're not really Catholic if you don't accept all of the teachings. And I remember a distinct time in my early 20s when I was just like asking God, look, some of these teachings, particularly around gender and sexuality, are not vibing. So change my heart. If it's really your truth, change my heart. Otherwise, help me be all the more convicted about your truth, even if it's running counter to what a lot of people in the church are saying. And God never changed the unease I had with those teachings. And I did my best as a youth minister to try to toe the line in terms of how I talked about chastity and purity and why women could not be priests in the church. I had the weirdest mental gymnastics, spiritual gymnastics. I was like, well, God created some people with uteruses and only they can be pregnant. And so God had to give the people who don't have uteruses something. And that's priesthood, maybe. I don't know. That was the bargaining I had to try to do to explain why, even though everything else in the church is like relatively complimentary, that's like the one thing I was like, ugh. So kind of what really, turned it all upside down was when my now spouse came out about 9 months into us dating as being trans and trans femme and non-binary, and wanted to begin their coming out journey. And I was like, well, I don't know if I get to count as queer just because you're gender queer. They're like, well, I'm not a man, so you're not straight. And I was like, but I don't know. And I've had a lot of difficulty giving myself permission to embrace my queerness. It's been very fascinating as soon as we were public about it and using they, them, and the word queer in terms of our coming out, how so many Catholic young adult people I knew just kind of like unfollow, stop talking to me. And I was even signed up. I was in the directory for Catholic speakers, and within a week of us posting about coming out, about our engagement and how we were just like, I don't know, the language used in that, the president of Catholic speakers was like, we had to take down your profile because somebody anonymously tipped us off that you've fallen away from the faith. And it was just wild to me that so much of my identity was as a Catholic was like under scrutiny and being questioned. Yeah, there's so much more freedom when you don't feel like you have to police how other people live their lives. The idea that
Yeah.
we as Catholics are like morally obligated to like tell people what they can and can't do with their bodies, to tell people how they can and can't express love to people with their bodies. It's very exhausting. And
It's also not very Catholic.
it's
That's
not.
the other funny thing.
Yes.
I think a lot of what we experience in the United States within these like more conservative Catholic movements, I think is really just co-opted strategies from the playbook of like Protestant evangelicalism.
I was going to say it's at the heart of what we've been talking about. This idea of spectacle at the center of creating this like construction of mysticism, of creating these vulnerable pockets of very tangible physical experience is at the center of what American evangelical experience is. It is the
Mhm.
megachurch. That's what I mainly see in some of those large scale conferences. It's the megachurch experience of collective divinity and devotion together.
I want to just like give major props and like shout outs to my spouse. I'm so grateful God placed them in my life. I did not expect that this is where God would lead me, and like that God would actually put someone in my life that like could feed all these like longings that I had in a partner and allow for there to be this like queer embracing too. I thought that that would always just kind of be this sort of like footnote element of my life that was like sort of like there, but like not a prominent part of it. And to be, I just feel so grateful for the ways that like they have helped me learn to trust my own experience more too. This practice of just like remembering how God is looking at me, like allowing myself to just sit and instead of navel gazing, am I good enough or whatever, instead of staring at myself in this self preoccupation, turning back to God and like, how is God looking at me right now? I think especially as a queer person in the church, just being able to like push all these other voices out, the trad voices, the conservative voices, the, you know, any external voices, the approval of others, whatever, really just centering on how does God look at me and what is God saying to me, and like realizing that no other approval is kind of what matters above that. That was very much a part of like some of the songs on the record I put out last year, was just like this sense of like, God, help me clear out the noise so I can just like receive your love. And it's when we do that, I think it helps us to be reminded of who we are ultimately.
Thank you so much for joining us for this conversation with Jessica Gerhardt. Her story and music really show us how faith isn't some neat, tidy package. It's messy, complicated, and full of moments of both sorrow and joy. Jessica's journey reminds us that carving out space for ourselves within traditions that weren't always designed to hold differences takes courage, creativity, and a lot of heart.
Very true. We hope this episode encourages you to embrace your own questions and your own contradictions with kindness and patience. Faith, identity, and spirituality are not about fitting into a perfect mold. They're about living authentically with all the beautiful complexity that entails.
If this conversation resonated with you, please consider supporting Whiplash by subscribing, leaving a review, or sharing this episode with someone who might find it meaningful. Your support means everything and helps us make these conversations available to more people.
And we always want to hear from you. Your thoughts, reflections, or stories. You can reach out to us on social media or on Substack. Connecting with our listeners is one of the best parts of the work that we do.
So until next time, keep questioning, keep seeking, and keep loving boldly, even when it feels messy or uncertain. That's where the real growth happens.
Goodbye!